Welcome to the FMCG Guys. I'm your host, Efren Rosario, and joined as always by my co-host, Daniel. Daniel, how are you?
Hi, Efrain. Very good. Excited to do this episode about a very exciting topic.
Absolutely. Well, little known fact that I think you and I both learned recently is that we both lived in Brazil earlier in our lives.
Yeah, quote unquote lived in my case because it was a month and a half. It was enough time to learn the language and I still speak it. So I'm happy to be a Portuguese speaker.
Well, I was there a little bit longer, so it took me a little bit longer to learn the language, but I'm in the same boat as you in that I still love to speak Portuguese whenever I can. I think as both you and I know, having lived there, Brazil is a really interesting place, both culturally, but also from a professional or business standpoint as well, in terms of the scale that it offers, both within the context of South America, but also globally. But at the same time, it's also a bit unique as well, just with regards to some of the dynamics in the market, but also obviously the language is different than pretty much the rest of South America. So it's a really, really interesting place to learn more about in terms of a lot of topics, particularly things like e-commerce.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a country of over 200 million inhabitants, the fifth largest country in the world in terms of size. That's also gone through a roller coaster of emotions, both economically mainly and also in consequence, probably politically. So today we have the pleasure to welcome Bruno Chinellato, who's actually heading up currently the online user journey experience at Via, which is the largest electronics and furniture retailer in Brazil. And yeah, we've invited him here to understand better a bit how Brazil has evolved in the last few years, and very specifically about how e-commerce has evolved and what potential it has to grow in the next few years. Hello, Bruno. Welcome to the show. How are you? How are things in Sao Paulo?
Doing fine. Despite the heavy winter starting, not heavy for you guys in Europe, but for us, it's comparatively to the summer, it's much worse, but everything okay here.
Well, Bruno, you will be happy to know that I've actually spent a winter in Sao Paulo, having lived there for a year. So yes, it is not as warm as the summer, but much better off than other places our listeners may be. So I think you probably will get little sympathy from them on that.
Yeah, so have I actually. I didn't know you'd spent a year in Brazil, Efrain. I forgot about that. I spent a month and a half there when I was 20 in a winter as well.
Ah, okay. So so all of a sudden they're breaking new ground in terms of things we all have in common. But yeah, Sao Paulo is a great place. I think we'll underestimate just the scale of it, particularly in relation to other leading global cities.
It's a huge city, 20 million people. I've been to New York and I thought, okay, New York is big, but I think Sao Paulo probably is as big as New York.
I would second that. So, well, Bruno, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show. And before we get started and start talking a little bit more specifically around e-commerce in Brazil, we'd just love for our listeners, just to get to know a little bit more about you. So if you could just give us a little bit of an overview in regards to like your background, your experience, and what you've worked on.
Awesome. So I was born and raised in Brazil, in São Paulo. So I worked for, I did a graduation in foreign trade, and I worked for many years in shipping companies. Then I worked for Monsanto and started working with procurement and logistics for Monsanto. And then I ended up doing some pretty crazy stuff at Monsanto, like buying things for farms. So I used to buy services that I didn't even thought they existed, like hawking to, just to scare off like the other birds, this kind of things.
You bought birds to scare other birds?
Yeah, that's probably the craziest thing I have negotiated ever. So I bought like more common stuff like spraying services like logistics. And that's when I ended up in logistics at Nike. And I'll pause here because that's when I met Daniel. So
that's when we met indeed. So Bruno and myself know each other because he was recommended to me. By the way, a shout out to the person who recommended him. We'll probably not say the name of the person, but she knows who she is. So she was recommended to me and I placed him at Nike at that time in a logistics procurement manager role for Brazil, I believe, right?
For the whole Latin America.
For Latam.
Yeah, for Latam, and I was reporting to the global team. Then one of the projects I was working on was the e-commerce for Brazil, that we needed to renegotiate and re-understand the terms of the contract with the players. I end up going so deep in that I end up in the e-commerce, and currently I'm working with user experience in a retailer. So I left Nike in Brazil last year. I'm working a big retailer, Brazil, the largest retailer for consumer electronics in Brazil. And I'm doing user experience role. So which basically Daniel changed my whole career by when he appointed me to Nike.
So that's quite a career trajectory from buying birds to consumer electronics and user journeys.
It is. It's quite challenging, but that's one thing we can stick to, is also, look into things and how can we do it better. So I think that same thought process you have as, a buyer, as logistics, that continuous improvement, it's something that you can apply everywhere. So I like to think that at the end of the day, I have been doing the same thing. It's just improving things that have been working to be better.
Yeah, definitely. Well, look, glad to hear that I made an impact in your life, and it seems like a positive one as well. So that's always recomforting, and it's one of the great things about my day job, because obviously the podcast, for now at least, is a side thing. So you ended up in e-commerce, as we've said, Bruno, and you're very specialized in the Brazilian market. So you've done it with Nike, now with your current company. If you had to summarize the overall situation of e-commerce in Brazil, how would you summarize it?
So I think that's an interesting thing about Brazil. So despite Brazil being one of the most connected countries in the world, so the internet penetration in Brazil is over 80%. The use of social media is also very intensive. 80% or close to that of the population use social media. I think 160 million social media users in Brazil. But the e-commerce here has been growing a lot. But if you look at those numbers, it's kind of puzzling to understand that only 70 million Brazilians have already bought online. So this is a research published last year. So when you look at that, you get to puzzle why it's not as big as in China or in US or in Europe. So I think that's the first thing when you look at it. The e-commerce from retail sales is also pretty low. It's not even 15%. It's 14 something. So it's still not as big as other countries, although we have really big internet penetration. There are some categories like the consumer electronics, for example, that are really leading the pack with 43% penetration, furniture 28, something like that. But when you look, for example, at fashion, that's less than 10% of retail sales done online. When you look at developed countries, it's over 20. So probably that's where for me the most opportunity it is. There's lots of growth to be captured at. In groceries, it's growing over all around the world, so it's not super big anywhere, but it's also fairly small here, 2 to 3%. So has grown a lot compared to 2019. We had 60 million digital buyers. Now we have 87, 88, something like that. And although we have grown a lot into 2020, pushed by COVID, 2021 was a decent growth as well. It was 27% growth to previous year. So for me, it's really an opportunity for companies to be in the e-commerce for Brazil. And Brazil economy is 70% of the South America. So if you are big in Brazil, you are big in South America. So I think that's definitely something to consider here. Some companies have joined, if you look, Amazon has been here for a long time, has been trying to grow. Not that many significant. Still, Mercado Libre is the most significant player, has been, let's say, probably the pioneer in the e-commerce in Brazil, in Latin America. So it has moved earlier, has more to capture. The other companies, most of it have about 10% of the market, including the company I work with. So I think there's lots of things to happen still in this market in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what percentage of the market Mercado Libre currently has?
30%.
30%.
Yeah, and the other companies have about 10%. So they are the biggest by far. Mostly they work with the third-party products. They are moving to have products bought and sold by themselves, but mostly it's third-party products. So their scale is pretty big. I think there's people on the two sides of the scale, some heavily third-party trying to move to first-party and some heavily first-party products trying to move to third-party. At some point, there will be some big consolidation in this market, I believe.
Yeah, well, we can go now a little bit, I think, to more the details of why like the Brazilian situation is the way it is. I think, Efrain, you had a question.
Yeah, so I think, specifically, I think for those of us not living in Brazil, I think we hear about it in the news, both from a political, but also from a financial standpoint as well. So I'm curious to understand for the latter, how do you think that has impacted e-commerce adoption in Brazil?
Well, I think Brazil in the 2000s have lived a really good phase because of the commodities boom, and the economy was public accounts were very well settled. So the 2000 to 2012, we have been living a really boom in the economy, lots of middle class gaining ground, families gaining purchase power that helped retail and mostly e-commerce retail, because the internet penetration has been growing a lot during that period to grow. But if you think that when the smartphones appeared was when some years later, the Brazilian economy started to stagger. So the Brazilian economy started to stagger in 2012. So mostly the smartphones started to mature by that time. So at the time that the e-commerce was maturing in terms of app, in terms of, it was really growing in terms of the e-commerce based on mobile and apps, where you'd really drive engagement, was when the families were really suffering with their purchasing power. Since 2018, there was some economic reforms to modernize the economy in Brazil, and it was going well up to COVID. So when COVID happened, there's a huge income inequality here in Brazil. So when COVID came, government had to step in the economy to sustain a lot of people that were not able to sustain themselves without working, without, the economy having to work. Lots of people we had lockdown, so we had to have people at home. Yeah. So they had no way to, sustain themselves. So that made the situation, the public accounts it's still fuzzy, but in the future, I think that there are some developments into modernizing the economy, but still challenging. Inflation in Brazil has been an issue for a long, long time. And now the inflation that's hitting Europe and US and other parts of the world it's potentializing the inflation that Brazil used to have. So right now, there's a moment that families are really suffering with the purchase power. So it is hard. On the other hand, I think Brazil is most a commodity exporting country, right? Mm-hmm. So at the same time, the Russian-Ukrainian war really affected the prices with the COVID messing with the all supply chains. But on the other hand, the prices of the commodities being really, really high, they are helping the public accounts and the GDP to grow. So I think if Brazil is able to do the homework, we might see a more stable economy, and that might capture, I think, the growth that we lagged due to digitalization during the last decade, which I think we are right now where we are. One of the reasons is the economic situation. I wouldn't say it's the only one.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, Bruno, because I know that I placed you like just before, I think it was beginning of 2014, if I'm not wrong.
2015.
15. Okay.
Yeah.
But that was like when Brazil was really entering recession and so on. But yeah, Brazil is just famously known to be a bit unstable, at least financially. Yeah. How do you manage that complexity as a business leader, like on a day-to-day? Like when you can't, like there's things that you can't control, obviously.
So I think the thing with the operating in Brazil, it's, as you said, it has been like growing in, staggering, really unstable. But as a leader, I think what we bring and what we are able to build in Brazil is like a mindset of both having no stone unturned. So it's always, trying to cut costs, look at efficiencies. Why are we doing that? And the other thing is to be brave enough to, innovate. Because the thing is, like, if you cut costs for a long time of period without innovating, I think you start to stop growing. Mm-hmm. And on those challenging markets, you need to do both. You need, to be really frugal on costs. You need to be really cost efficient, which being a buyer for me is something that comes naturally. Yeah. But the thing is how do you really efficiently innovate? There's one thing that right now we have seen in the last years, I think, huge innovation, but not always efficient, right? Lots of companies coming with innovation, but lots of cash burn. When you look at in the scenario of Brazil, where you have higher interest rates, or you have more established companies, of the companies I worked for, you need to innovate, but you need to innovate efficiently. You need to innovate being profitable. I think you need to look into the startups. What I have done is like look into the startups, see what they are doing. I think what they get right is they get to the pain of the consumers, which I think big companies sometimes fail to. But I don't think that getting to the pain of the consumer and cash burning in the without, being profitable at any point of time, it's also the right thing to do. So we need to look at the pain of the consumers as big companies. How do we move that? How do we move profitably? And that's what I have been challenging the team. What can we do better? But what can we do better knowing that we are not doing something that will be, not profitable, or something that will be really not sustainable? Because what we see is lots of innovation. It's really amazing, but they're really not sustainable, and they end up being futile and not enduring. So we really need as big companies to be profitable, sustainable innovation to drive to the consumer. And that's the mindset I try to bring for the team. Yeah. The good thing, I think, is Brazil, just one another thing, another bright side, the last decade in Brazil has been hard. So companies that have survived in the last decade, they know how to be frugal and they know how to innovate. So I think that's something good to take out of a crisis.
So I think to that point, some of the learnings that you mentioned in terms of innovating profitably and really starting or getting to that consumer pain point, I think those are things that are obviously applicable any market you choose to operate in. But the last comment you mentioned started to allude to what are some of what's unique about operating in Brazil versus, for example, places in Europe or in Asia. Are there any others that come to mind in regards to what makes operating, particularly in the e-com space, unique in Brazil versus some of the other regions in the world?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to work with Latin America. So initially when I worked with the Latin America, I thought as many people, when you look at Latin America, I think there's a similarity there. But I think that Brazil is kind of unique even within Latin America when you look at it. First thing, the language is completely different from the whole Latin America. That itself is different. But aside from that, I think the thing when you look at Brazil is it's Brazil, if you look at the overall numbers, and that's how usually people try to understand Brazil, it might be really misleading, because when you look at the average GDP, for example, you think that Brazil, it's comparable to other markets. But when you look at like the income gap and how it's centered, it's very different. So in Brazil, you could have like if you try to put the word into looking to the word into average GDP and try to make conclusions that it's the same thing to operate in the US and to operate in other poorer countries in the world, I think it's also something that happens in Brazil. So Brazil e-commerce, for example, is mostly centered in the South and Southeast. And the reason why it happens is because most of the wealth is centered in the South and Southeast. If you look at the other regions of Brazil, there's lots of inefficiencies. There's lots of to happen, and they are very different. So in terms of, I think, would say everything like income, even cultural things, there are cultural barriers that are different from the South and Southeast to the North, Northeast. And even I'm generalizing North and Northeast because they are very different regions itself. So when you look at that, I think Brazil, it's very unique. I think it would be the same that trying to operate in Europe, but not including other countries of Europe, like Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Africa all together. I think that's the kind of thing that would say that's operating whole in one country only in Brazil. And for e-commerce, that's really, really challenging to growth to be profitable, because most of the scale, it's being captured, is already captured, right? When you look at Southeast, and when you look at São Paulo is about 20, São Paulo city and metro area is about 20% of the whole e-commerce in Brazil. Wow. And that's really hard to capture additional, because you're basically fighting very mature market. So at the same time, you need to look outside of São Paulo to grow, but you need to, invest a lot, because there's lots of inefficiency about logistics, credit, this kind of things. I would say that the uniqueness of Brazil is at the same time, it's one country, but on the other side, I would say it's a continent.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I mean, I think that the fact that you mentioned, like the North versus the South, if we have to generalize it, yeah, it's like just a very big country, I think. No, that's like another difference. It's a very big country. It's not like China, which is China's quite densely populated for the size it is. Brazil has very big areas of farmland, not to mention the Amazon. And the Northeast, of course, the economical situation is very different to the South or the Sao Paulo area, right? So what would you say, like apart from that, any other complexities? You're mentioning credit, you're mentioning logistics. Tell us a bit more about these, and just to help all other people how to overcome these, or other business leaders, how can they potentially overcome these?
So I think Brazil has some idiosyncrasies that we look like. For example, if you look at Brazil, it has very modern banking system, one of the most modern banking systems in the world. Have gone through several crises. It made the system stronger. So when you look at it, I think a really strong banking system has really good credit system, but we don't. That's one of the things that happens in Brazil compared to developed economies. Although there's a huge banking penetration, there's not that much credit penetration in Brazil. So the penetration of credit for even credit cards is fairly low. And that's a challenge when you put the income gap, because you have people that have a low purchasing power, or not that big purchasing powers to buy, for example, electronics or furniture and pay at once. So they need credit for buying this kind of things. But on the other hand, we don't have a very strong credit market. So that's challenging for e-commerce, where most of transactions are paid on credit card, because lots of the growth needs to happen on top of the credit card infrastructure and the credit infrastructure to be set up. So that's one of the things that I think also has been restraining the growth in Brazil. But there are some big evolutions on that, right? I think that's one thing. The other thing that we mentioned is the size of Brazil, right? So Brazil is 5% of total world land mass. So it's the 5th largest country. So the infrastructure in Brazil, it's hard to put, as you mentioned, like the Amazon. We have a big city in the middle of Amazon, Manaus, which we used to have to get barges to get there. So when you think that they are now building a road, but it's unthinkable to do logistics efficiently countrywide without this infrastructure. So that's why I think that most of the companies have kept so far centered in the South and Southwest, where there's infrastructure, where's their income, there's power. But I don't believe that will be where they see the future, because they need to grow. And to grow, there's a third thing, that is the tax system. So Brazil is a federation, and tax system in Brazil is super complex. So when I look at Brazil, I think that there's lots of opportunity for growth in the e-commerce, but there's some significant challenges. But those challenges are no different than the challenges that company will face going out from developed countries to develop into other developing countries. I think the bright side of Brazil is that you have everything in the same place. So Brazil, for me, it's a huge growth opportunity, but it's a huge laboratory for international companies, because if they figure out how to do it here, they can scale that to do, cross-border fulfillment in other countries that are not that developed. They can understand how to give credit where there's no credit. I think they can learn to build their own infrastructure for the retail and e-commerce growth, and not depending on banking, not depending on huge logistics operators to be in a country or another, which I think is how most companies grow. They saw in the e-commerce in other countries, the infrastructure, the credit infrastructure, the logistic infrastructure they use that. I don't think that worldwide you'll see much of that. So I think Brazil is a place that companies can learn, how can I build my own bridges? So I think it's a very exciting place to be, because lots of companies coming here to understand, to innovate, lots of executives from Brazil, going to other countries to try to replicate things here.
Yeah. So to that point, based on, or given some of the challenges you've shared with our listeners today in terms of the income gap and this, let's call it almost like a split personality in regards to very modern parts of the economy versus others that are still fairly limited to the masses. What do you see as the main opportunities for Brazil? For example, how do you see companies in Brazil, particularly those focused on e-commerce, solving the limited credit access situation? Are there things like buy now, pay later that are starting to take shape there?
Yeah, so that's one thing. So when you look at Brazil, I think there are some things that companies develop it as a way to overcome those challenges, not digitalize it some ways. They have that solution and you say, oh, this is a good solution. We just need to digitalize. So buy now, pay later, I think it's a great example. So in Brazil, brick and mortar stores, the one I'm working for, Via, have been giving credit for the consumers directly for 60 years. They have grown lots of their business as that. Sometimes they make more money in interest than they make in the product. And they have built that themselves, as a solution to overcome the interest rates. Some other companies does that as well. I think what's happening right now, I see lots of companies coming, to Brazil. I went to the VTEX Day a month ago, which is the biggest e-commerce event that we have promoted by the VTEX. And lots of companies trying to offer buy now, pay later here. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at, there are some big companies already doing buy now, pay later for decades in Brazil. And they have knowledge, they have really good efficiency, not losing money. The default rate is really low. So I think those companies are now trying to understand how to, can I make that a product and how can I sell to others? Because it's a good product instead of people buying for other companies that are trying to bootstrap or to do a proof of concept into their product. How can we get something that's really good and sell to the whole market? So Brazil, it's very mature on that. And I think that's one thing that companies can learn with those companies that are well established and migrate to other parts of the country. The other thing, when you look at the logistics challenges in Brazil, as we mentioned, plus the tax challenges, companies have been really, really efficient. Companies that have endured have been very efficient how to do logistics countrywide, how to place the distribution centers, where to place, when to use the distribution centers. So when you think about omni-channel and using stores as mini hubs, brick and mortar retailers in Brazil have been doing that for a long, long time. Shipping from other stores, shipping from stores to customers that bought by phone and even that bought online. But I think they didn't thought it structurally, as a strategy, but they have come to understand that now that this is going to be, the big difference from them, because you cannot put distribution centers all over the country without having the same scale. Or you can have stores and distribution centers, all that footprint, all at the same time. It's very costly. So companies are very thoughtful on how to use stores at distribution center, mini hubs. Via, for example, has more than 1,000 stores in Brazil, and all of them are used as mini hubs to send products for the consumers and even to receive products from third-party cross-dock and send to the consumers. So when you look at that, it could be something replicable into, cross country, because in Brazil you have a different tax system for each state. So companies have not only solved the logistics problem, but they are solving the tax issue, which is something replicable for cross-border, which is something growing.
Yeah. Well, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So like you said, companies have in essence been faced with these challenges, and they've been pretty resourceful and, like you said, bootstrapping certain solutions that have actually now are in vogue, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And with all this on the table, Bruno, I mean, how do you see the situation of e-commerce in Brazil evolving in the next 5 years? One thing that comes to mind, for example, is that you've talked a lot of opportunities for retailers. Do you think that they'll grow market quota versus the likes of Mercado Libre or Amazon? Or, how do you see things evolving? And in general?
I think there's still a lot of growth to capture. So I do think that there will be some growth capture before a consolidation. And I think the consolidation, it's going to be much different from what we saw so far in other countries, because I think very unique as well, Brazil I wouldn't say that because everywhere else is happening the same thing, but I think when we thought about transactions in the past, we used to think about, companies to consumers. But I think there's a big trend right now that's the companies are just platforms for doing business. So I think it's companies to consumers, consumers to consumers, companies to companies. So it's C2C, B2B, B2C all at the same time. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the, for example, Mercado Libre, they were a consumer to consumer. Then they started to be a business to consumer. When you look at the Via, used to be a business to consumer. Now it's business to consumer, but it's also a business to business. So I think there's a big consolidation happening where the role of the retails is just to make viable for industries to get their product for the consumers, or for consumers to get their products to other consumers. So e-commerce, for example, used products, which is very, very trendy for luxury right now. Mm-hmm. It's something that in Brazil has been done for lots of things because of the purchase power. So I think that what we'll see is that we'll see less people doing or framing themselves as retailers, and more companies framing themselves as, platforms for a relationship where the consumer is used to interact, and they could be interacting with their own company, with the third parties, with the industry directly, to many other peoples, but the infrastructure that those companies set, the credit infrastructure, the logistic infrastructure, at the end of the day will just make it viable for the consumer to do whatever he wants to do. So I think that we'll see lots of that. So it's really hard to say where the consolidation will happen, because I don't know if the consolidation will be just retailers or retailers to platforms or whatever. I think there's lots of growth to be captured before that. But at a certain point of time, I do believe that we'll not be talking about retailing. We'll be really talking about managing relationships with the consumer.
It's definitely a lot to consider, particularly, like you said, over the next 5-10 years. So, Bruno, this has been great. I've learned a lot. And even for somebody who lived in Brazil quite a while back, obviously the country has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years and continues to evolve. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us and our listeners. I did want to end with one final question. This is something that we ask all of our guests. It's asking you to think about, what advice would you give to your younger self at the beginning of your career, based on all you've learned in the time you spent at Nike and at Via and at other companies and at Monsanto as well?
That's a big one, profound one. I probably tell my kid, but I think the thing I would tell my younger self or my kid is that focus, on the experience in your career, for focusing in the self-growth, because I think career is not about, getting bigger roles. It's about having a good story to tell in the end of the road. So that's one of my philosophies, and that's why I changed it from procurement to logistics and to e-commerce and now to user experience, because I just want to tell good stories at the end of the road.
This was Bruno Chinellato from Via in Brazil. Great conversation. I think I learned a lot. I'll be able to talk a lot more about e-commerce in Brazil from now on. Ephraim, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think like you, Daniel, I now feel like I have another topic that I can discuss and converse in about Brazil other than the football or soccer team.
Yeah.
Lots to unpack in that conversation with Bruno. First and foremost for me, I think, the initial takeaway that I had was when Bruno shared with us that e-commerce has a lot of runway still in Brazil. Comparatively speaking, only 14% of retail sales happen through an e-commerce channel or fulfilled through e-commerce. And if you compare that to the 20% on average that we see globally, still a lot of room for growth when it comes to e-com.
Yeah, I think that also like the conversation we had just reminds us that, we tend to probably want to put countries in the same box, like LATAM, like Latin America, but like every country is a bit different and very different in this case. I mean, Brazil just has very unique characteristics. So I think it's a bit of a great unknown country in a lot of ways, but probably especially in e-com as well.
Yeah. And I think, we went into this conversation, knowing some of those in terms of some of the cultural and language differences that make Brazil unique when you think about it in the context of LATAM. But, as we learned from Bruno, that I think there's a lot of little intricacies that make Brazil more unique than that, just in relation to, for example, e-commerce as well. Like for me, I think the other thing that I took from the conversation with Bruno was talking about the challenges that he has been able to, in essence, identify, but also in essence, work through from a bootstrap standpoint, in a lot of cases around things like cross-border commerce.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you think about Brazil and how big it is, in a lot of ways, it's similar to China in that regard, in that, it's hard to think of Brazil and China as one country, as opposed to like 5, 6 plus regions that are all different. And you have to deal with different taxation and you have logistic issues that you have to work through. So it's really interesting to get his perspective in regards to, how retailers like Via and Nike have been able to, in essence, work through some of those things in Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, the duality between the North and the South, for instance, is like very big. So it's like two very different realities.
Absolutely. And to me, I think the other thing that I took from our conversation as something for me to go and think about more was Bruno's comment around how the role of the retailer in Brazil is also evolving. So if you think about it, going from, let's call it more of the traditional distributor of brands and products and really ultimately evolving to more of a relationship platform. That mean in terms of both the services that you offer, but also the capabilities that you need to deliver that service as well. How is that going to evolve, not just for the retailers, but also for their brand partners along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks to our listeners for joining us for another conversation. I think this one was super interesting, also going into a new continent, which we hadn't explored yet. Remember to follow us on LinkedIn if you're not yet. And also a shout out to our partners in the US, the CPG Guys, where Peter and Shri are producing fantastic content week on week, twice a week actually, so more frequent than us for now. And thanks a lot. And as always, you're very free to contact us. We're very, very open to suggestions, feedback, guest suggestions as well. And we'll see you in the next episode of the FMCG Guys.